Amen. We're going to dive right in this morning. We've been talking a little bit about time. You might remember last Family Sunday, we talked about when God breaks his promise, but we didn't mean breaks, we meant slows it down, right? And then last Sunday, Pastor Schulz talked to us about when God runs late. So you might notice a theme happening here because I want to talk this morning about time versus timing. Time versus timing. Last Sunday we said our God is on time, but time is his creation, and he is on his timeline, not mine. Like time, I too am God's creation, right? But unlike time, I was created in his image and in the likeness of him. I do not bow before Father Time because my Father is his Father too. My God is on time, but he is not in time. And we can be grateful for that because he sees and knows so much more than we could ever know. So speaking of time, I cannot believe that we have found ourselves in the month of March already. I do not know how this has happened, but we are here at March 2nd. And so I always love to do this when I can in March because a special thing happened in this month thousands of years ago, and it's a holiday called Purim in the Bible. Now, this isn't a God-ordained feast, so you will not find Purim in Leviticus where God tells us about the feast and which feast to celebrate, but it is a biblical celebration that you'll find in the book of Esther, and it's a special tradition that even today the Jewish people celebrate this year, every year. It falls on March 7th, and it's a time that they celebrate Esther and who she was, and there's many pieces of it. They give to the poor, they help people who are hungry, they feed people outside of their family, but mostly they're celebrating the power of God's intervention. Aren't you glad that God intervenes for us again and again and again? But as I was looking at Esther, because I knew we were going into March, I couldn't get over the way the time worked in Esther. But even though it's a set date that we're confronted with throughout this book, the way that God operated in timing every single step of the way, even with the flesh that was involved and the things that were not necessarily godly, you see God show up in Esther again and again. And if you were to try to make this plan yourself, it would never work out. So we're going to just settle in for some story time for Family Sunday, if y'all are okay with that. We're truly going to have Sunday school this morning while I tell you the story of Esther. And so first of all, Esther has a particularly bad guy. Does anyone know the bad guy in the book of Esther? His name? Haman, you're right. So when the Jewish people tell this story every year on Purim, which is going to be this Friday coming up, every year when they tell the story in their service in front of everyone, children, adults alike, every time they hear the name Haman, they say, boo! So we're going to do that today for fun, to make sure y'all stay awake. I actually ordered some noisemakers because they do that as well, but they didn't come. Amazon told me this morning it was on its way, but now it's coming tomorrow. So y'all, boo, exactly. So y'all are my noisemakers this morning. So the book of Esther starts out, and we're going to do a little bit of telling and a little bit of reading. The book of Esther, actually, Pastor Andon, do you have your phone? If you will open up the notes, which, did you know that the notes are on the Promiseland Church app? You can pull them up every service. I'm going to have you read some when we get to those portions.
Okay.
Okay, so our story, it starts with King Xerxes, who was the king of Persia and several areas all around there. He was a very powerful king, and the Jewish people are living in his kingdom under bondage. So, due to some chain of events that I won't get into today, the king Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, that's the same king, finds himself needing a wife. So, he sends out a decree to all the land, letting everyone know that he needs a wife and that every young woman that is not married should come to the kingdom to see if they should be his wife. So we have King Xerxes as one of our characters, and then we have Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai is Esther, a young woman, Esther's cousin, who's much older than her and has adopted her as his own child. So the Jews are living there in captivity in Persia, but God has commanded the Jewish people that while they live there in bondage, they are to follow the laws of the land. So when Mordecai gets this report that all the young women are supposed to report to the king as he searches for a queen, Mordecai tells Esther, "You're going to have to go and possibly become the queen." So Pastor Randon, will you read to us Esther chapter 2, verses 8 through 11?
Yes. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem and the fortress of Susa and placed in Heggai's care. Heggai was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. He quickly ordered a special menu for her and provided her with beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maids specially chosen from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. Every day, Mordecai would take a walk near the courtyard of the harem to find out about Esther and what was happening to her.
All right. So Esther's gone to the palace. Mordecai is staying nearby, checking in, right, to make sure she's okay. But I want us to take note here where it says, Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. So keep that in mind, okay? So Esther goes through 1 full year of preparation. All of these women are getting these special beauty treatments, these incense baths, myrrh, and all of this stuff for a whole year. Imagine 1 whole year living at a spa. That's pretty great. But it might be a little scary thinking of what's to come. But for 1 whole year, all of these women were just in preparation to be brought before the king. And you see in the story that right away, Esther's being shown favor. It has nothing to do with who they know she is, right? Because she's keeping that a secret. But she's already found favor with the one in charge of these women. And so when it comes time for Esther to go before King Xerxes, he falls madly in love with her. Like deeply in love with her. All of these other women have met the king, but when he sees Esther, there's something about her. Can you imagine what that might be? There's something different about Esther. And so he chooses Esther and he puts the crown on her head and he says, I found my queen. She's going to be my new queen. So Pastor Randon, will you read to us again? Chapter 2, verse 18.
All right. To celebrate this occasion, he, the king, gave a great banquet in Esther's honor for all his nobles and officials, declaring a public holiday for the province and giving generous gifts to everyone. Even after all the young women had been transferred to the second harem, and Mordecai had become a palace official.
Okay, so God, we see now, has put Esther in position, but it's timing, right? He's working in the background, and it's just thrown in there that he's also put Mordecai now in position. Go ahead.
Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's direction, just as she did when she lived in his home.
Now, I want to remind us here, when we hear about the story of Esther, we think, oh, God sent Esther to deliver his people, right? But I want to remind us that Esther didn't know the story when Esther was Esther. Esther was just a young girl that knew God and that loved him and that trusted him and that trusted Mordecai to give her wisdom and direction. And again, it tells us that Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. And it's no mistake that it continues to say she was still following Mordecai's directions, just as she did when she lived in his home. So, as we see Esther and Mordecai moving into position, Esther's hanging out around the palace one day. And he overhears some men hiding in a corner, making a grand plan of how they're going to kill King Xerxes. And Mordecai goes straight to Esther, who's in position to access the king, and tells her, Esther, they're planning to kill the king. You have to go to the king and tell him that they're planning to take his life and that this is exactly how it's going to happen, okay? So Esther goes and she tells them, and they go and check, and sure enough, this exact plot that Mordecai had said was lined out and ready to happen, and the king's life was spared. Time versus timing. Mordecai just happened to be positioned in just the right spot for just the right moment. A key thing that we need to know in this story and kind of where the graphic comes in is the strategy that we see playing out here. How God is putting each and every person in our story exactly where he needs them. This story is all about timing, being in the right place at the right time, right? One interesting thing to note about the book of Esther, and you can go test this if you'd like to go. It's only 10 chapters, so y'all could read the whole chapter in one day. But one interesting thing to note is that God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, not one time. But all throughout the book of Esther, we see God, because only God could operate in the way that things needed to be operated in this book. So it might be that we're meant to learn that God is most active in our lives when he's the least visible. Sometimes, that's good. Pastor Schulz added that line. But that's okay. Pastor Jay always picks those as his quotes to put up on Instagram anyway. So could it be that we are meant to learn God is often most active when he is least visible? How often have we said, God, why? Where are you? Why not yet? What are you doing? Can't you see that I need you to move on my behalf? And it feels like he's invisible, but the truth is he's navigating every step of the way. He has a plan and a purpose, and he's working it out. So God was invisible at this time to most of the people in the story, right? But looking back, when we tell the story, we see him again and again and again. And that's how it is a lot of times in our own testimonies. When we're going through them, it feels like he's not there. But then when we look back, it's like, oh, that's why you did it this way. That's why you took me through this. That's why I had to go through this process. You were working things out, and you were doing things in me that needed to be done, right? I am must be our rest when the what is and what ifs are our experience and our test. Amen. Okay, now this is where y'all get involved. Because in this next passage, here comes the bad guy. Every story has a bad guy. So, Pastor Randon, chapter 3, verse 1 through 7.
Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, over all the other nobles.
Wait a minute. Son of Hammedatha, the who? Agagite. Y'all might remember this from where we've been with David, the king of Agag. These are some messy people. Okay, go ahead.
Making him the most powerful official in the empire, the favored one. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect.
Right.
Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman
Y'all are bad.
about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew.
Uh-oh. So Mordecai has revealed his nationality. Go ahead.
When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, lots were cast in Haman's presence. These lots were called Purim, to determine the best day and month to take action. And the day selected was March 7th, nearly a year later.
So a time has been set, and a deadline has been given, and the enemy has decided to cast lots to determine when the exact best time might be to destroy God's people. And I don't know about you, but time after time, there have been deadlines set in my life. And I tell God again and again, but God, you know, you can't be 30 years late for me because I have a deadline set right here. So I need you to show up in this way by this time. And in the middle of our trials and our frustration, we hear and see that the enemy is over there casting lots. How should we get them? What should we do? What would be the best way to undermine their faith? What would be the best way to take them down? And I want to tell you that when the enemy is out to get you, it's for a reason, because God is doing something so great in your life, and he has planned and purposed for something for you that you just have to trust. That even though it may not feel like it's the right time, God's timing is perfect. And he positions us and he places us in just the right spot, so that as his work is planned out and as his plot continues, again and again, we're going to see his faithfulness. And we're going to look back at the end of the story and say, oh, I see, God. It wasn't about my time. It was about your timing, right? So once again, we see this over and over also. The Jewish people must have gotten real tired of this. They have been put in a position where everyone is out to get them, and they are in desperate need of a deliverer. So Mordecai goes into deep mourning for the Jewish people, and he puts on burlap clothes, and he's weeping, and he's crying, and, he now has a job inside of the palace, but he refuses to enter the palace. He refuses to enter the temple because he can't enter those places in his mourning clothes. So do you see here where Mordecai has given his identity? And how easy would it have been for Mordecai to say, why did I ever tell them that I was Jewish? Why did I ever reveal who I was? Why did I ever say that out loud? What was I thinking? I told Esther not to. And again, it comes back to us again and again. God, I really messed up. He must have forsaken me now. I've really taken a wrong turn. But it's all about God's timing. Esther chapter 4, we're working our way through the story.
When King Esther's maid and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was in mourning. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the square in the front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message.
So far, Mordecai has told Esther again and again, keep quiet, keep our secret, don't reveal your identity. But now he's telling her the harder step. You've got to go to the king now, Esther. You got to go help our people now, Esther. You got to lay your life on the line and go do this right now, Esther. So how does Esther respond in verse 10?
Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the province know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner courts without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days.
So Esther's not feeling much favor with the king right now. He's not asked for her. He's not messaged her. There's no DMs, right? She's like, not right now, Mordecai. Okay, keep going.
So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at this time like this.
Okay, right there. I find it so interesting, and we quote it so often, where in Esther it says a couple times, not at this time, but at a time such as this. A time like this. Keep reading.
If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this.
So that word right there, time, if you go and look up the Hebrew word that's used there, it's not a common Hebrew word that's used for time. And right there, it actually means God has arrived. So Mordecai is telling her, God is going to intervene at this time for this moment. It's up to you if you're going to be a part of this, right? So again, we see where God has not been brought up one time in this book, right? But we see again and again that he is showing them step by step if they will just obey. Okay, go ahead.
Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him.
I almost named this message Esther's Sacrificial Truth, because I feel like we see again and again where she is a sort of representation of Jesus, where her proclaiming at the wrong time who she is would be her destruction, right? And again, we see it here where Esther decides to sacrifice her life. If I must die, I must die. I'm ready and I'm willing to lay my life down for my people. There was a story, I was listening to a rabbi talk about Purim, and he shared a story about a Jewish man who had been in prison for, I think he said 7 years, if I'm not mistaken. And he had gone through all of these processes, and there's actually a very similar story to this right here in our church that just happened this year as well. But I want to wait and let that person share. So I'm going to tell you this one. But there was a man who had been in prison, and he was charged unjustly, and he had been waiting. They had been appealing. They had done all of the things that they could do to try to get his, what's the word I'm looking for? Sentence, turned around. And finally, they had completely given up. And they went to him and they told him, I'm so sorry. This was the last thing we could try. We've gone again and again and again. We've done everything that we can do, and there's nothing else we can do. You're going to have to wait out your sentence. And I think it was a sentence of like 29 years or something. And the man turned to the people next to him and he said, okay, I'm going to start gathering up my things. I'm about to get released. And they go, did you not hear what they just said? They've tried everything. It's all done. And he said, yes, that's when God shows up. When everything else has been tried. And sure enough, the president, he was on the list of people that were released when the president took office. And so God did show up, and he was released. And it was after every single thing had been tried. And so God does that for us over and over, but sometimes he's waiting for us to exhaust all of our efforts and reach a point where it says, you know what, God, even if you don't show up for me, I'll still serve you. Even if this is what my life is meant to look like, I'll still trust you. Even if I'm supposed to live with pain and hardship, I'll still give my life for you. I still choose you again and again and again. And when that piece of us dies, that part of us that we've been so desperately trying to hold on to because we think if I have to give up this, then everything is lost. When we let go of that thing, whatever that is for you, that's when God says, okay, now I can do my work. Now I'm ready because you've truly laid down everything to come and follow me. So Esther says, if I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away, and they started fasting. And Esther and her maids started fasting. And she was praying, and she was asking God, please, Lord, show up for me. And she gets up, and she goes before the king. And she walks into that inner court like we've been talking about. Again, you see so many examples of what God's trying to say in this book. And so she goes before the king, and she goes into that inner court. And when he sees Esther, he's reminded that there's something special about Esther. And he reaches out that scepter, and he allows her to speak. So Esther doesn't tell the king as he welcomes her in, and he says, what can I give you, Esther? Anything, up to half my kingdom. And Esther says, I just want to be with you. I just want to spend time with you. So would you come to a banquet that I'm going to prepare for you and for Haman, your bestie, You can bring him along. But Esther says, if you could just come to a dinner, because the invite, she needed to have Haman there, and she needed to have the king there. Because sometimes, like David said, he prepares a table for me in the presence of mine enemies. Sometimes you have to invite your enemy to the table. So Esther said, I'll prepare a table for you and for him in the presence of my enemies. What if we just had that confidence that God had it? That when our enemy showed up knocking at our door, we didn't have to run away scared. I've been talking to Brendan about this dog that's about to drive us bananas if we don't get this thing trained. And I've been telling him, you cannot run away from him. You are bigger than him. You are smarter than him. And you have to be the one that lets him know it. So when the enemy comes knocking at your door, don't go running away. Let him know, my God is bigger. Through him, I'm stronger. And I don't have time to mess with you. So if you're hungry, come get a bite of food because my God is here and he's ready to deal with you, right? So King Xerxes comes for dinner with Esther, and he sits down and he tells her once again, Esther, you found so much favor with me. What can I do for you? And I was so curious this time as I read the story of why did Esther not just tell him then? Why? What was it in Esther's heart that made her not just tell him right then? But something told her the timing wasn't quite right. Something told her it's not quite time. So as the king asks, what can I do for you? Up to half my kingdom, Esther says, I just want a little bit more time with you. Could you come to dinner tomorrow night again? Could we spend a little bit more time together? You know, sometimes we're so desperate to get something from God that we rush right past his presence. Don't rush your worship when you're desperate for intervention. Don't rush your worship. It's important for us. We are the bride. He is our king. He wants to spend time with us. We're created to worship him. So don't rush and don't take for granted the time that we get to spend with our king, right? Esther knew that the king loved her, that he was becoming more and more attracted and desired to her. And so instead of saying her, could you save my people, possibly? Esther said, could you come to dinner again? I just want to see you again. I love you. I love being with you. I love serving you. And I just want to bless you again, right? They say the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, but the way to the king's heart is to value his presence. So meanwhile, Haman's feeling pretty good because he's now had dinner with the queen and he's scheduled for dinner number 2 with the queen. So Haman's starting to feel pretty excited. Y'all are dwindling off, but you're doing good. He's starting to feel pretty excited, and he thinks, you know what? I know I have a date set to get rid of these Jews, but I'm going to go ahead and take care of Mordecai right away. And he goes and he tells his family, I have a plan. I'm going to destroy and kill Mordecai. I'm going to do it this way. He builds the props and tools that he needs to take care of Mordecai. He has it all laid out. So that's how our bad guy, I'm not going to say his name, is spending his evening. Meanwhile, the king has had a lot to drink, and he's not feeling so good, and he goes to bed, and he can't sleep. Something's keeping the king awake. And so he's lying there, and he tells his people that are there, can you just read me some stories about some wonderful things that have happened to me? Wouldn't we all love to have that when we can't sleep? Could you just read me some stories about some wonderful things? And so they start to read some stories, and wouldn't you know, the story at the top of the page is the story of Mordecai saving the king's life. And the king wakes up, wide awake now, as Haman is there at his house, building his, I don't want to get too graphic, but Haman's building what he's going to need to deal with Mordecai. And over here, the king's waking up, and God's telling him his plan for Mordecai. So the king calls Haman, and he tells him, tell me, if there was a man that I just wanted to honor more than anything, a man that the king wanted to show the entire country how great this man was and how wonderful he was, what should I do? And so Haman, thinking that he's talking about him, comes up with a great plan. You should get the king's horse, and you should get the king's robe, and you should get the king's ring, and you should place these on this man and put him on the horse and ride him through the town and show honor and tell everyone how great this man is and how wonderful he has honored the king. You see, God knew that Esther needed one more night for God to do his work. His timing is perfect. It feels sometimes like he's repeating things in our mind, but he's setting up the stage. Do y'all know that we have a professional chess player in this church? Sister Brewster told me that. Joseph Brewster was a chess player as a kid. I was hoping he'd be back. I know they went to Paris. But he could tell you, it's all about the strategy. It's planning it. She was telling me that sometimes he would play in his mind without even moving the pieces and just looking at where things were going to go. This is how God operates, because it's not just about us and the thing we think is the answer. God is trying to save an entire human race. And there are parts of your story that are supposed to touch on other people's story. And there's parts of your assignment that are touching on other people's assignment. And when you get so zoned in on March 7th, I need redemption. By March 7th, I need God to show up. You're missing the mark, and you're slowing down the timing of what God is trying to do in your life. So the king tells Haman, that sounds like a wonderful plan. Boo, there we go. Okay, y'all can take a break from that. He says, that sounds like a wonderful plan. I want you to go and do that for Mordecai. So Haman goes and does that for Mordecai. And he sets it up, and he goes home defeated and humiliated. And he tells his family what happened that day. And his family says, well, what are you going to do to him? You're already setting up to kill him. And before Haman could answer, a knock comes at the door. It's time for dinner with the queen. And they take Haman back to the palace. Who's sitting over there? Brendan, you're killing it. Great job. So they take him. He goes back to the palace. And now we're nearing the end of our story, Esther chapter 7.
So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On this second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom. Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet. For that would be too trivial of a matter to warrant disturbing the king. Who would do such a thing? King Xerxes demanded. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? Esther replied, this wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen.
You see, Esther's adoration and worship of her king, and her humble obedience, and her courageous faith, slowly but surely through obedience, was winning over the favor of the king. So that when Esther first starts speaking to the king, she says, my adversary, my enemy. But when she repeats it again a little lower in that verse, she says, our adversary, our enemy, because she has gained favor with the king through her time and her loyalty to him. Meanwhile, Haman's manipulation has sprung the trap on him. You have to be careful when you get into the kingdom of God that you don't get mixed into the politics. The Bible says the first shall be last, the last shall be first. If you are positioned where God wants you to be positioned, you don't have to worry about the politics. He's working, and it's going to be on his time and the perfect timing so that your life works out exactly the way it's intended to work out. There is no telling what God will do if we'll just submit to him and trust his timing, and most importantly, entertain his presence. We're coming to the end here, and actually a lot of people don't mention the rest of the story of Esther. A lot of times, if you hear it in a kid's book, right here is where it ends. Esther saved the people. What a miracle, right? But March 7th was still scheduled. The Jewish people were still destined to be killed. And actually, when Esther went to the king and told him, okay, what can we do? Can you cancel this? He said, I'm so sorry. I've made a proclamation. It's been signed with the ring. I can't do anything about what's already been assigned for that time. But, he said, I'm going to put Mordecai in the same position that our bad guy was in. And I'm going to put a robe on him and a ring on his finger. And whatever he can decree that will work against that decree, I'm all about. But I cannot go back on my word. How often do we stop our story too soon? We say, okay, I'm done with that. God's got this. There's still more to be done. There was still more to be done, and there's so much more for us to do, for our families and for our kids and for the next generation. Family Sunday is all about raising up a generation of kids who understand and know how to fight in the kingdom of God, how to fight for something that's worth fighting for. I told a kid this week when they asked me, will I ever stop doubting or wondering, is God real? Is God not real? I just want to have complete faith and trust in the fact that he's real. And I said, well, I can tell you, if you're faithful to God, and if you live for him long enough things are going to happen along your journey, and you will reach a point where you say, I don't know about all of you and your doubt, but I know that my God is real. I've seen too much to turn away. Me and Nina were talking today when she walked in, and it just came up about the fact that again and again and again, God's shown up, and it's never how we envisioned it or pictured it. Esther thought for sure, okay, so now can you just fix everything? You're willing to save us. And the king said, I'm sorry, the time's already been set. The way that the story actually ends is that God made a way for the Jewish people to fight against their enemies. And Mordecai wrote another decree that said, when the people come to your door on March 7th, don't give up your home. Don't turn around and run. Fight. You have the authority to fight for your life and for your possessions and for your identity. Don't fall back when they come knocking at your door. But this time, the Jewish people weren't just there under their own authority. They now have a Jewish queen, and they now have Mordecai, who is the king's right hand. And so it says in the book of Esther that people actually became Jewish because they were fearful of what the Jewish people would be able to do to them in that time of fighting. And so when March 7th never changed, it was still the set date, but everything that they thought was going to happen to them turned. And it turned out to not just be about defeating Haman. Haman wasn't, thank you, he wasn't the only one that needed to die. There were other people behind him that had the same intentions and the same purpose. So if it had stopped there and Haman had been killed and only him, the Jewish people would have been up against this again and again and again. But instead, the time that had been set for their destruction turned out to be the time for their deliverance. I want to tell us today that God is on his own time, and that's beautiful. I would never have it any other way. His plans are so perfect, even when they feel so bumpy. And the beautiful thing about God being on his time, working with his timing, is that we can rest in the grace that he gives us to trust that our Father, who loves us, is going before us. When Joshua took over to lead the people in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6, he must have felt a lot of weight stepping into that role. And it says that God told him, so be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid and do not panic before them. For the Lord your God will personally go ahead of you. He will neither fail you nor abandon you. Esther did not save her people. God stepped in and saved her people. But God did use her faithful and courageous obedience to position them where they could prosper. He did place her in the palace for a purpose. He did give her uncle favor and wisdom to guide her. But just like Esther had to risk her life and stake everything on faith and obedience, so too the Israelites had to rise up and destroy their enemies once God provided that opportunity. God is going to give you the victory. He is going to give you the victory, but he is not going to fight a battle that was meant to make you who you're meant to be. You have to fight that. He will destroy your enemy, but he will not protect you from the process that he's doing in you to get you to that perfect place. Can we stand today as we close? What if the king was standing right here in this room, right here at this altar, and he said, I'll give you anything you'd like, up to half my kingdom, anything you'd like? Would you be quick to tell him, I want this, I need that, I could really use a healing, I could really use an intervention? Or would you pause for just a moment and say, could I just have another day at your house? Could I just have another moment in your altar? There's a song that said, if I could just sit with you a while, but you can. You can sit at the table of fellowship with your God, and you can eat the bread of gratitude and the flesh of your sacrifice, and drink the wine of pure worship. I believe that today is the day that we're meant to pursue more of him. And just let the enemy think for a moment that you've completely forgotten about his plot, that you have no cares about what he's designing, about the lots that he's throwing. Let the enemy see that he can't intimidate you to doubt. And show him that even in the midst of all that's happening in your life, you still have time to pursue the King. These altars are open this morning. It's earlier than usual. If you have been focused on things in your life that seem so big, I want to challenge you today to bring those to the altar and to tell God, you know what? I don't even care about that anymore. All I care about is another day with you, another moment in your presence. I don't know what it is that you're trying to do inside of me, but I'm okay with it, and I'm willing to go through it. I don't know what the process is and whose other processes I'm playing a part in, but I'm ready and I'm willing. If I must die, I must die, but please don't take your cup from me. I believe God has already set the date and the time for your deliverance, but he's waiting on you to get in alignment with his timing. Let's lay our head down tonight, knowing that we've done everything in our power to rest in him, that we've read his word, that we've tasted and seen his goodness, that we've felt his spirit, that we sought after more time with him. And let's see what our God does when instead of begging for bread, we hold a banquet before him and we ask him to sit with us for a while. I want to challenge you this morning to just take a few minutes and to come to the front as a sign that you are ready to lay it all down. And let's just worship him and soak up who he is and rest in the fact that he is a God that has perfect timing, that we don't have to understand. And there's beauty in that. Amen.
You are faithful,